Ringo Starr ultimately reveals the truth about George Martin. The music world was taken aback when Ringo Starr, the famous drummer for the Beatles, opened up about his turbulent relationship with George Martin, sometimes regarded as the fifth Beatle. Martin's impact on the Beatles' sound cannot be denied, but Ringo's revelations shed light on the conflicts, misunderstandings, and personal grievances that simmered beneath the surface of what seemed to be a friendly working relationship. These disclosures showed that the collaboration between one of the most famous producers and musicians in music history wasn't as smooth as it initially appeared. Ringo Starr talked about his relationship with George Martin and the deep emotional problems that affected their relationships in addition to the music. Ringo recalls how Martin often questioned his drumming abilities, especially in the early years of the Beatles. Even though Ringo wanted to help, Martin would sometimes suggest hiring session drummers for particular tracks. This was a blow to a budding musician trying to make a name for himself. Martin's doubts about his drumming skills left a lasting emotional scar, despite the fact that Ringo's laid-back, easygoing manner helped to reduce the tension. Throughout his time with the Beatles, Ringo maintained this underlying resentment despite his appreciation of Martin's production skills. But the issues didn't stop there. Their arguments centered as much on creativity as they did on drumming. In contrast to George Martin's extremely strict and methodical approach to music, Ringo favored a more relaxed, organic vibe. The band's vitality was often depleted by Martin's obsession with getting every note and take absolutely right, particularly when their more experimental albums were being recorded. Ringo recalls how Martin's insistence on multiple takes would sometimes stifle the band's inventiveness. Ringo saw this as more than simply implementing Martin's concept. It was also about the band's need for autonomy to try new things and push boundaries. There was a clear difference between Ringo and Martin's views on music, which would only become more pronounced during their cooperation. One of the most obvious examples of tension is when the Beatles recorded their White Album in 1968. Known for its vast, experimental approach, this record marked the lowest point in Martin's relationship with the band. Martin, a meticulous and classically trained producer, struggled to instill discipline in what he saw as a disjointed project. Meanwhile, the Beatles were under pressure to break away from conventional arrangements, especially from Lennon and McCartney. The band members often ripped Martin's meticulously crafted pieces apart in search of something pure and authentic. This continuous struggle between chaos and order deeply agitated both sides. These were some of Ringo's most contentious sessions as the band battled to stay true to their vision while Martin attempted to force his own. But it wasn't just the Beatles who suffered as a result of Martin's tactics. Ringo's revelations also shed light on the broader challenges Martin faced throughout his career. Despite his contributions to some of the most famous records in music history, he clashed with other artists because of his perfectionism. His partnerships with the well-known guitarist Jeff Beck serve as the finest illustration. Often, Beck's raw improvisational guitar playing stood in stark contrast to Martin's systematic, precise approach. Beck would search for spontaneous, emotional guitar riffs while Martin insisted on having complete control over every note and nuance in the studio. Although this never-ending tug-of-war generated some incredible moments, it also created a claustrophobic atmosphere that left both sides emotionally traumatized. Similar to this, Martin's work with the band America showed how his fixation on perfection often led him to lose touch with the musicians he was trying to help. The Americans admired Martin's intelligence, but they were fed up with his demanding demands. His lofty standards were often impossible for them to meet because of his constant pressure to be perfect. In contrast to merely striving for musical brilliance, this was about feeling the emotional toll of constantly having to meet Martin's expectations, frequently at the price of their own creative independence. As the 1970s approached, the rock music landscape was changing. The loud intensity of the music scene was becoming more and more at odds with Martin's more classical, quiet style. While the Beatles had pushed limits with their sound, the new musicians of the post-Beatles era handled music in a more raw, unplanned way. Martin's knowledge of classical music made it difficult for him to adapt to this adjustment. His methods, honed in the controlled environment of Abbey Road, sometimes seemed out of tune with the rapidly shifting granite terrain. Several musicians criticized Martin for putting precision before emotion, saying that his classical training stifled the raw, rebellious energy that embodied rock and roll. Despite these criticisms, George Martin's genius was undeniable. His orchestral arrangements and technological expertise helped create the Beatles' recognizable sound. But as Ringo's revelations show, this perfectionism often came at a price. For each artist who appreciated Martin's skill and attention to detail, his technique was seen as limiting. More significant than just producing outstanding music were the psychological repercussions of working under Martin's exacting standards. For many, Martin's relentless pursuit of perfection was both a boon and a bane. Ringo Starr's account of his collaborations with the well-known producer enhances George Martin's reputation. It portrays a man whose brilliance was matched by his flaws, whose high standards resulted in some of the most well-known records ever created, but also caused countless arguments with the same musicians he was trying to promote. Even the greatest successful collaborations have their share of failures. As Ringo's revelations offer as a reminder, the difficult balancing act between artistic freedom and control was the root of the tension between Martin and the Beatles, which went beyond straightforward creative disagreements. It is a story of paradoxes, a man whose genius shaped the music of a generation, yet whose attention to detail sometimes annoyed and misunderstood players. Ringo Starr's insights provide a deeper understanding of George Martin in the context of his legacy. Despite Martin's indisputable contributions to music history, his disagreements with the musicians he worked with highlight another facet of his genius. Despite his battle with perfectionism, he was a flawless producer, and his relationships with musicians were impacted by both his positive and negative traits. Ringo's story enhances Martin's legacy rather than diminishes it. It reminds us that creating music that lasts is never simple. In the studio, it entails pushing boundaries, competing with one another, and sometimes even getting into trouble with one another. Like the music he helped produce, Martin's legacy is a complex symphony of light and gloom that pays homage to the cost of genius. Even though the group was known as the Fifth Beatle, George Martin did not like being around them. Ringo Starr's revelations provide us a glimpse of the internal conflicts that resulted in their intricate yet well-known collaboration. And as we continue to enjoy the music Martin helped create, we do so with a new understanding of the man who, despite his flaws, shaped the musical preferences of a generation.